Welcome to the EW Podcast. I'm your host, Eric White. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2-part conversation with Lisa Perry on the topic of nuclear weapons. In part 1, Lisa and I focused on 3 specific nuclear weapons policies that were created to keep us safe, but today might actually be putting us in danger. Here in part 2, we focus on the role culture can play in changing these policies, and we look to history for examples on how culture and public opinion have influenced our leaders before. We also discuss social media, the future of nuclear weapons, and Lisa gives some details on what to expect from the next season of her podcast, At The Brink. Here's a quick bio on Lisa Perry. Lisa is the communications director for the William J. Perry Project and the host of the At The Brink podcast. Lisa is the granddaughter of former Secretary of Defense William Perry and has dedicated her career to sounding the alarm about the modern threat of nuclear weapons for the post-Cold War generations. Lisa is committed to empowering the public by breaking down the complex issues surrounding these weapons. Her show, At The Brink, is about humanity's most terrifying weapon and the stories of those who have shaped its history. At The Brink features the personal stories of presidents, cabinet members, congressmen, nuclear physicists, atomic bomb survivors, military officials, and activists. Without further ado, here is Lisa Perry, and thank you for listening. Let's touch on the culture thing because there's two pieces of media that come to mind that are directly related. The first is Silent Spring, which is a different topic, pesticide use, which had the power to change policy. And the second is The Day After, which reportedly had a huge impact on Reagan. And so I wonder what role you think culture could play in fixing this problem. Obviously when The Day After came out in '83, the attention on nuclear weapons was way higher. Do you still think something like that could capture people's imaginations and even influence leaders?
I think that culture today could be a huge influence on this issue right now. I think that the difference that it's going to be today is I don't know if there's going to be that one linchpin sea change event like The Day After. Particularly because, as you said, at the time that The Day After happened, this was already on everyone's minds. People were primed to be thinking about this. They were doing duck and cover drills. People at the time by the 80s their entire lives had grown up with this threat, kind of like we're seeing today with the younger generation have grown up understanding and knowing about the threat of climate change and are coming into their own now saying, I'm tired of, having to be afraid that, my world is crumbling around me. We must do something about this. That was sort of the environment that you come into in the 80s when you have The Day After. And you actually see in that same decade, the largest ever nuclear demonstration, actually largest public protest in U.S. history up until that point happens in the 80s. I believe it's 1986. In the summer of 1986, the nuclear freeze march in New York City was 1 million people marched in the streets of New York City to demand a nuclear freeze, which was this idea that it wasn't asking for disarmament. It was just asking to halt all nuclear production and testing just in that point in time. It was a very simple request to say, U.S. and Soviet Union, just halt, don't go any further. Things have been ramping up. Tensions have been ramping up. Let's just put a pause on everything. And obviously with the intention of let's go on, continue from here.
Did it work? Did that actually influence a freeze? How was that received?
We are working on an episode about this.
Ooh, nice.
So Eventually you'll get some more fun details. We've interviewed people who were like organizing the march and there at the time, and you had major influencers speaking at that march. You even had Coretta Scott King spoke there. Ed Markey, who is one of the big congressmen who speaks on nuclear issues today, was actually back then also speaking at the march. So he's been involved in nuclear issues for quite some time. He today actually has a bill with Ted Lieu trying to establish eliminate presidential sole authority legislation in there. So he's been in this fight for a long time.
Good guy.
Yeah. But they were very successful in garnering public attention, and they actually ended up passing a number of local resolutions throughout the country, of like regional resolutions to declare support for a freeze policy. But it didn't end up manifesting in a full nuclear freeze, partly because things were already, the Soviet Union was already falling apart. It would end up getting to that point really before they were able to reach that resolution. Soviet Union collapsed, and then it was sort of a bit of a moot point. But there's a lot of evidence to show that it did have an impact. And interestingly, Reagan was not a huge fan of it.
Of the march or
of the freeze movement in general.
Okay.
Despite his eventual support for nuclear elimination and really being open to the idea that we need to eliminate nuclear weapons. He wasn't inherently supportive of the freeze movement, but it actually was quite influential on Gorbachev, and would end up spurring things that would lead him to communicate with Reagan, and leading to the Reykjavik summit, where they got together and said, hey, maybe we should just like call it all off and eliminate all nuclear weapons. Get like really, really close for a hot second there. So, those things do have an impact. It's not just necessarily going to be in ways that you think it will.
Yeah, maybe we can just dwell on that real quick because I think it's such a hopeful, it's tragic that it didn't work out, but it is a hopeful story, because I think it shows that this problem isn't that hard if our leaders are willing to really work together across national lines with people. So maybe you can just give a quick backstory on what that meeting was, what was actually said, and how it fell apart.
Yeah. So the quick take on the Reykjavik summit. So this was U.S. and Soviet Union coming together to discuss nuclear issues. And this was at a time where like things were ramping up. And as the day after was already out, public opinion on nuclear weapons was really negative. The freeze movement was strong. And Reagan was starting to show that his mind was starting to turn on this issue, that he actually had different thoughts on how maybe we should approach this. And what's interesting about the Reykjavik summit, that this aspect was not planned, but Gorbachev brought this notion to Reagan, say, well, why don't we just call this off? Basically is like having these in-depth discussions, and there was not a lot of communication at the time. They were very hostile towards one another in the beginning of Reagan's administration. He was really not open to communicating, and they suddenly were saying, oh, well, actually, we're open to this discussion. And let's explore this. And unfortunately, what it comes down to is why it fell apart was that Reagan was really wedded to his idea of missile defense, which the Star Wars program. Mm-hmm. And he was basically saying, well, you know, I'll explore that, but I want to be able to still have the Star Wars program. I want to have missile defense regardless. And that was a non-starter. So, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. We need you to commit fully to this. And so things didn't end up going anywhere, but it did lead to things like Reagan declaring nuclear weapons should never be used and nuclear war should never be fought. That elimination is what we want to strive for, which was a real turning point up until that point. That was not the position. Like, elimination was not a part of the discussion at that level up until that point. So it really showed that like culture did have an impact. There was these influences. There was this public pressure that was being put on all of these issues that really did have an influence. Getting more onto the question of culture, I think that today it's going to be a lot of different things. There's not one solution to this problem. It's going to be 100 different solutions being implemented in 100 different directions. But it's important to not feel overwhelmed by that and actually think that that means that we all have a part to play, that we all can contribute to this, because everything that moves the needle away from danger is helpful. So even if it's just, you know, listening to this podcast and sharing this episode with your friends, that is moving the needle because you're raising awareness. And I actually find it pretty exciting in this field. And one of the reasons why I sort of got hooked in and couldn't get out was the fact that we're kind of on the ground floor of a new movement here. When it comes to things like climate change and some of the other big existential issues around the world, there's a lot of people working on those things. And there's a lot of initiatives happening on it. But because there is such misinformation about nuclear weapons, because there's so little public awareness about the risks that we face today, there's so much room for improvement. Which means that there's the entry point for making a difference is actually really high. We're sort of, you know, pre inconvenient truth era right now with nuclear weapons, where it's like, oh, you know, people don't know this as a general understanding. It's not an accepted norm. We're before it's an accepted norm that, you know, we need to do something about this. So even if it's just like convincing your friends, talking to your teachers, talking to your family, sharing things on social media, like those are actually really significant things that can happen today. People, you know, will talk about, you know, Facebook activism or things like that as being inefficient. Actually, for nuclear weapon stuff, like there's a real power there right now because the awareness is not there. That so the entry point for doing something about this is actually much lower.
And one rebuttal to that, I don't know if this is kind of off topic, but to support your point that that kind of social media momentum is important, is have you seen the movie The Dissident yet?
No, I don't think so.
It's a documentary that just came out. It's about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist.
Okay. Yeah.
And in it, they talk about how Saudi Arabia has this team of people called the ants, and they're literally just a bunch of people on computers who are trying to get things trending in Saudi Arabia. So obviously, the Saudi Arabian government, you know, MBS, has recognized the power in having things trending on Twitter to the point where he has an army of people manipulating what is trending to influence thought and to influence people to think that the crown prince is a good thing. So it's like, don't underestimate the power of that. Our leaders aren't, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And it is so true. I mean, you look at President Trump, and I think that is completely an argument for the fact that public opinion and social media is a huge power in the world today in generating public and political positions, because that is really how he got elected. His popularity is based on his social media presence. That was how he got out his political views. That is how his supporters absorbed their political views. So using that tool and spreading this message and spreading awareness and education through social media for this subject matter is actually a huge help, because there is, we need to reach that threshold. We need to reach that tipping point where enough people are not just aware about this, but aware about things we can do about this and want to impact change, to cause enough of a ruckus for our political leaders to actually start paying attention. And that is happening. It's when it comes to nuclear issues, you have to look at sort of the long arc of action for these things, and not lose hope just because it doesn't happen year to year, but you look at over the years that there has been progress, that we have made improvements, that things are getting more secure, but we just have to keep pushing, and we have to keep advocating, and we have to keep looking for new solutions to the problems that are there. Yeah,
I really appreciate you saying that, because that's something I try to remind myself when sometimes this stuff can make me really depressed to think about. And I'm not in it as deep as you. I don't spend as much time, but to, prep for this, I was spending a lot of time thinking about it. And I was like, look at the big picture. We once had 70,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. We've made a lot of progress. So yeah, I agree. And I appreciate you just pointing that out, that zooming out is good.
I'll tell all your listeners that, so the episode that we're working on with about the nuclear freeze movement is around exactly that, which is this notion that it can be really overwhelming when you start diving into this subject matter. I think it's actually one of the big hurdles that we have in communications about nuclear weapons issues, is that people hear this sort of stuff, existential threats, and their brain just shuts down. I don't want to hear about this. I've got enough to worry about. I got to pay my bills. I need to, I don't know if I can make rent this week. Like, I have to pay, I'm dealing with student loans. I have all of these things in my life that predicate, like, I don't have time to put this on my plate. And I sympathize, certainly. But it's not about it's not about scaring you into thinking the world's about to end. It's about motivating you to say, hey, we can make a difference. And the thing that I like to say to give people hope about this is actually when the big comparison you can make to climate change is one of the other big existential threats to humanity, is actually nuclear weapons are a much more approachable subject matter than climate change. Because at the end of the day, we created this problem. We invented this problem, and we can dismantle this problem. We could dismantle it tomorrow. Well, not that quickly, but theoretically, like we can make the decision saying, like, we don't want this to be a problem anymore. We're done. Let's end it. And by the end of the year, it wouldn't have to be a problem anymore. We can't do that with climate change, but we can with nuclear weapons. And that's actually really exciting, because you say, well, we could actually eliminate a threat to humanity within a year if we put our collective mind and energy towards that solution. And that there is progress that has been made. That, as you said, we used to be at 70,000 nuclear weapons around the world. And now, okay, we're at 15,000, but it's not 70,000. And we also have a number of treaties that have eliminated and constrained and helped with different things. You look at things like the Iran nuclear deal, which, yes, we have withdrawn from it right now, but the fact that we were able to negotiate it in general is a huge win for the notion that in the future, we actually have a system set up for how we can prevent a country from going nuclear that wants to go nuclear, that we can negotiate our way out of that problem. And the Iran deal is something that we can enter back into. It's not completely dead. It's not, we haven't gone too far. It's very much within possibility that we can re-enter it and we can roll that clock back. And once again, we've put a lid on things. And that's what the future looks like. It's we keep working our way, keep working the problem, and get our way slowly closer to safety. And those progressions have happened. We don't test nuclear weapons anymore. We haven't eliminated testing as a principle, but we don't do it anymore. We've constrained those things. We have eliminated some of the kinds of nuclear weapons that we have. We're looking at, the discussion around eliminating ICBMs is one that's happening right now. People are talking about this in the news and the media. That could be a next step. It's really about looking at how we can tackle this problem by breaking it down into smaller components,
right,
and more digestible ways of lowering the threat, lowering the danger. And I do want to mention, it's important to have context when having this discussion, that the level of risk that is around this, it's hard to conceive of because it's all theoretical. But the level of risk is low. The risk of nuclear catastrophe is low. And we're not out here ringing the alarm bells like this is definitely going to happen tomorrow or next year or next week. The likelihood that one of these scenarios that we've talked about happening is unlikely. It's a really small percentage point. But the reason we need to care about it is because the outcome, if it were to occur, is so catastrophic that it outweighs the really small possibility of this happening, saying, well, it doesn't matter if it's a small possibility, we need to address it seriously, because even a 1% or a fraction of 1% chance of the entire world ending is something you need to pay attention to.
Right. Yeah.
But that's when we're talking about this, it's not to say you need to go to bed tonight and be terrified that you won't wake up tomorrow and everything will end in nuclear hellfire. That's not so likely. So, we have the ability to make some changes here. We have the ability to take the reins and say, we don't want this to be the norm anymore. We want change and we demand it because, this is a democracy and this is our government. And we can say that we do not accept this as a reasonable risk as part of our existence. And change can happen from there. And in fact, there are other nations who are interested in this. And right now, in fact, the United Nations passed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, was passed in 2017, and it was ratified just at the end of last year and went into effect in January, which people say, what does that do if the UN says that nuclear weapons are prohibited when the nuclear nations themselves refuse to sign on? Fair, but what it's showing is that non-nuclear nations are willing to come together and use their collective political power and their political will to say, we don't accept this anymore. We're not okay with this. We're not okay with you having these things. And we're taking a stand. And not only are we committing that we won't have nuclear weapons ever, and if we have anything like that, we're going to dismantle them, we're also going to put pressure on other nations to come around to this establishment. And it's establishing the norm, saying the norm shouldn't be, we'll try to not cause a problem with these. The norm should be, we shouldn't have these because there is no benefit to humanity to having these weapons. they only cause harm. They don't stop war from happening. Right. They only cause threats to our entire existence. And it's just working our way to that place is where we're working to get.
Yeah. Well, that feels like a nice stuck landing to me for the conversation. I am curious though, season 2, is there a planned date for that to come out? Is there anything you can share besides what you've already shared? Like, what can people look forward to?
We are working on season 2 right now. I'm really excited about it. We're aiming for it to come out in September. Okay. Hopefully we will be sticking to that. But actually we're hoping to, in the meantime, put out some supplemental episodes and bring in some highlights from different podcasts that work on different nuclear issues so that people can kind of get a little bit of an overview of like different stuff that's going on, keep information coming in. We're producing a couple of animated videos that we're going to be sharing on social media that people can, you know, put out on their social media efforts to try to bring people into this. And for the second season, we're really trying to dive in away from sort of the big picture, big government lens on nuclear weapons and try to dive really deep into the untold stories around nuclear weapons and the people who are often ignored when it comes to the conversations around this. And, you know, not talking about the generals and the Secretary of Defenses and the presidents, but, you know, the people suffering outside of the uranium mine in Navajo nations and, you know, the people who are living in the Marshall Islands and had to abandon their indigenous homes because they've done too many nuclear tests outside of there, and they're suffering from long-standing radiation sickness from those experiences. And looking really at taking a step back and looking even further away at the lens of around nuclear weapons of, okay, it's not just a matter of military and defense and security, that this is something that is an intersectional issue. It affects environmental justice, racial justice. It has influences on, you know, gender issues, influences with indigenous communities, economic opportunities.
Wow.
That it is a cross-sectional problem, and it needs cross-sectional solutions. So.
Wow, that sounds awesome. I never even thought about in the story of people living around uranium mines. That never even occurred to me to consider. I really look forward to that very much. Yeah, that's cool. Well, Lisa Perry, thank you so much. This was a pleasure, and I fully support what you're doing, and I'll be watching. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.